Hi everyone, welcome to this week's public opinion video lecture. As you can see here, and as you can probably predict based on our reading, today's discussion is going to be on media effects. This will be the first of what I envision to be a two-part series, I suppose if you want to call it that. This reading, this week, Iyengar, Peters, and Kender. We'll talk about a few things like agenda setting and priming, and then there will be one additional reading here on media effects, Chong and Druckmann for next week, which I'll mention here a little bit more going forward on a different sort of avenue of by which the media can affect public opinion. We'll get into that discussion here in a second. I hope everyone is coping with the quarantine well and the current situation. In general, again, I'd emphasize that if you have concerns or difficulties with the new online format in the class, stay in touch with me. Let me know as soon as possible. One thing I wanted to mention here before getting into our material is just the project, the semester project. So hopefully you're at the point now to where you guys have all been thinking about your experiment and what your conditions are going to look like. So right now I would say, take a moment and think to yourself, ask yourself the question, what do my experimental conditions look like? What does my control group look like? What do my treatment or treatments look like? If you can't answer these questions right now, or if you don't have some idea, I would strongly implore you to get in touch with me as soon as possible. And beyond that, just in a general sense, I would encourage you to avail yourself of me as you work through the project, right? So even if it's just as simple as you want to run your ideas by me and get a sense of what I think, that's something that I would encourage you to do. If you're somebody who's still, you're worried about the nature of your study or how it's an experiment or what your experiment will look like, please stop by my Zoom office hours. We'll be having them again this Wednesday, or as I mentioned in the last video, if you want to make an appointment outside of the normal Zoom office hours or just talk to me via email, whatever works for you, just please get serious about completing the project. The due date is remaining the same as we talked about, April the 20th. One other thing I wanted to mention with respect to the project is a few of you have asked me specifically about this part. So here's the now out-of-date project guidelines. So consult my previous video and my previous email if you need to update yourself on how the project has changed. But in terms of part 2, which is roughly the same besides the draft due date, a few of you have asked me about this part. As an appendix to this document, you must provide a complete questionnaire that includes the questions you'll ask on your survey and the experimental treatments you will employ. So just to give you a sense of how this might look for your project, I've uploaded this document to Moodle, which is entitled Sample Questionnaire. Okay, so this is just what an example of a questionnaire that I had sitting in my Dropbox that was put together, I think, a few years ago at this point for a study I ran. So this would be something you could use as a template if you want for what your questionnaire appendix might look like. There's no specific format that I'm looking for, but this is just the way I would do it if I were putting together a questionnaire to give to people and have them understand what's actually going into the study. This is an experiment that was maybe a little bit more complex than what most of you will probably be doing. So I included at the outset this sort of diagram to just walk people through the various parts of the experiment are. If this is something you think you might want to do, that's fine. If your experiment is pretty straightforward, this may not be necessary for you. But you see here, I've got this. This happens to be an experiment that I ran with a bunch of different conditions, over 10, I think a dozen in total. Actually, looks like about 17 in total. 14, excuse me. So I mean, yeah, this is just to give you a sense of how you might go. So the survey in this case starts out with some information on this screen about, this is all centered around this hypothetical candidate, James Dixon. The purpose of this study was to see how people respond to political scandal. So I've got some, just information starting out about my hypothetical candidate. My actual experimental conditions are down here, to where the important point is just that I've got the text of everything I'm presenting, in terms of, I have a manipulation in terms of what type of scandal is it. Is it a sexual abuse scandal, an adultery scandal, or a financial scandal? There's some additional conditions here with respect to the certainty of the accusation. the point here is just that whatever's going into your experiment, if it's a text-based treatment, if it's images, if it's video, you want to include that in the questionnaire, right? So that I should be able to read through this and get a sense of exactly what, if I were a subject in your study, what I would be seeing based on which condition I'm assigned to, right? So here's my description of what the treatments are looking like. Following that, I've got various different questions. Again, the language here is the wording, in other words, of the questions, the response options, they're all here. I've got these post-treatment questions. And so you can read through this. This, again, is just an example I had. If you need to format your questionnaire a bit differently, that's fine. But you can read through this and get a sense of what I'm looking for if it helps you. Right? So this is available to you now on Moodle. If you have any questions about this beyond what I'm talking about, let me know. I'd be happy to discuss more. For now, though, let's set the project aside. That's all I had to discuss here at the moment. Again, my main point here is just if you are not yet confident in what your experiment is going to be, or anything else you're not confident about, you're going to want to get in touch with me. And if I don't start hearing from some of you, there may be a few of you I reach out to specifically, but just in general, please let me know how you're doing on your experiment and what I could help you with. All right, so let's get into our discussion here of the material for the day. So again, Media Effects specifically will be referencing this reading you did, and you submitted your QQC for this reading earlier on in the week, last Wednesday. And so here, it makes sense to just start out like we usually would do in this sort of discussion of a reading. What is our research question? In this case, the research question that Iyengar, I'll just say Iyengar et al., are speaking to is one that is a lot more broadly approached than just this reading, right? So this is one reading out of an entire literature that's very expansive, addressing this question of how, or maybe in parentheses, we could put whether, the mass media influence public opinion. And obviously, you guys read the paper. You know that Iyengar et al. Speak to this question. They've got their own input here and their own answer to this question, which we'll of course get to. But prior to that, I wanted to just set the stage and give you a sense of what the history of research, scholarly research, is on this question, right? And it goes back to this point almost an entire century. And so I wanted to just give you the history, which is, I think, informative in and of itself, and it also just helps set the stage for exactly what Iyengar, Peters, and Kender are responding to. So what is the scholarly environment, the research environment that they are speaking to in their paper, right? So this is a 1982 article, and so it's something that isn't immediately, it's not something that's contemporary at the moment, right? So I think it makes sense to just give you a sense of what the backdrop in 1982 would have been and how that's relevant for today. And we'll talk about the time dynamics of this paper a little bit going forward. So I wanted to just, again, start out with what have scholars said about this question leading up to this 1982 paper. To give you the backdrop here of why this becomes such a major question in political science and social science or communication studies more broadly. So the early 20th century, this is obviously when the mass media are coming into being through a couple of different means, right? The first being radio, probably. Newspaper certainly has a role here prior to what we're talking about. But really, when we talk about the mass media and its expansion, I think most would put it in the early 20th century as radio begins to proliferate more and more, right? So in the 20s and 30s, in which you have radio sets becoming ubiquitous in almost every household, right? To where it's instantaneous news that people can, more or less instantaneous, right? There's still time lag. It's not like today, but radio expands in the 20s and 30s. And there are also in the information environment a few things going on that are troubling to scholars in terms of how mass media potentially could be used, right? This is even prior to television, which is obviously an even greater expansion of the mass media. But in the early 20th century, specifically in the World War I and World War II environments, scholars observe things that are happening in the way that information is being used and distributed through the mass media that trouble them a little bit, right? So this is sort of motivating this question about how or what the capacity is for the mass media to influence public opinion. So first of all, we have World War I, during which you see propaganda on both sides. It was sort of print propaganda, radio propaganda, whereby radio probably not so much at that point in time. In this case, we're still in the print realm. But World War I, both sides, both the the Allied side and the German side, mostly we don't really talk too much, I guess, about the Austro-Hungarian or German allies. Mostly the Germans and the Western allies are putting out propaganda that's aimed at keeping their side, their public, their population engaged with the war and willing to continue it, right? So you see, the way this breaks down a lot of the times is that the Western allies are putting out propaganda saying the Germans are doing this or that. The Germans are putting out propaganda doing the opposite. In the post-war world, the post-World War I at this case world, a lot of it is revealed to be really just fabricated, right? To where the various sides are making things up and putting them out toward the public to drum up fervor, which later on it turns out it's not really accurate, right? So a lot of the World War I propaganda turns out not to be really rooted in truth. We won't get into the details, but that's the overall point as far as that goes. When we get into the slightly later portion of the 20th century, right? We're getting into the 30s, we get into the 40s. We see maybe an even more troubling phenomenon in the way that information in the mass media is being used. We see in Europe a lot of, maybe not a lot, but several very noteworthy examples whereby you have what were previously liberal Western democratic regimes being replaced with fascist regimes. Okay, so the most notable example here are probably Nazi Germany, right? So we see Germany, which prior to 1933 was, when, I'm not trying to say it's a perfect society or anything like that, but it's a society whereby it operates more or less like what we would have expected any other European country during that period to operate like, right? We go into 1933, we have this really sharp and dramatic change to a fascist totalitarian regime, one that obviously goes on to commit countless atrocities, and we see this sort of transition into to totalitarianism throughout the globe in the 20th century, in various parts of the globe is probably a better way to put it. And so the role of the mass media here is again called into question. You have the Nazi regime obviously seizing complete control of the means of mass communication in Nazi Germany, putting out various propaganda to try to obviously shore up support for the regime, and once war breaks out, direct the public to think about the war in a certain way. And so overall, the major concern here is just whether the mass media, and specifically propaganda, is being used to, or could be used to assist in the rise of totalitarianism. Right? This is the major concern. Right? We have Nazi Germany. You have this totalitarian evil regime coming from out of more or less nowhere in a very short. That's a simplification, but in a very short period of time, it's coming into power, seizing complete power, and ostensibly using mass media to its advantage. Okay. So this is the backdrop for the discussion, why scholars in the early to mid 20th century start getting really interested in the mass media. So first of all, it's an emerging phenomenon to where mass media didn't really exist as it did as it did in the radio era and the television era. So there's this evolution in technology that's driving this research, and then there's just the circumstances by which the mass media is potentially being used that's driving this question. And scholars, they come over the course of the 20th century leading up to this 1982 paper, they advance a couple of different theories or models for understanding the way that the mass media works. The first of which here, it's a fairly colorful term, the hypodermic needle model. Okay, this is basically the idea, and I would preface this discussion here just by saying that this is obviously sort of a pessimistic look on things, and it's not a model that really receives much empirical support. It's more speculation in this case. Sort of the 1930s to 50s era. This is prior to the start of survey research and the application of survey data, or really a data-driven approach in general to study the media. This hypodermic needle model is basically the idea that the government can, as the term is implying, inject whatever, maybe not the government is a better term, but just the media in general can inject ideas into the public's consciousness, and people are going to accept these ideas really uncritically and without questioning the content of them, right? This is the main fear, right? So if you're looking at Nazi propaganda, you're someone studying the rise of totalitarianism in general, your fear is this, right? The idea that whoever secures the means of mass communication can put in the public's mind and persuade them to think whatever they want. Right? This would be something that has very negative consequences when those who seize the means of communication have deleterious motives. Okay, so here the idea, media messages are uncritically accepted by the public. So as I mentioned, this is not a model that this is kind of predating the use of empirical methods to really study systematically media effects. Okay, so this is not something that I would say had any sort of major support in hindsight that would lead us to think that this is the case. We'll point to numerous reasons as we go along as far as findings that really sort of reject this idea. But this was the major fear, that this model was potentially the way that media effects operate. Eventually, though, we get into the 40s and the 50s, and more scholars are looking at media effects from an empirical perspective, right? And you would also recall here in our discussion of the historical progression of survey research, this era that we're going to talk about going forward is the one in which surveys in general, are becoming more and more proliferated. Right? So we're entering an era now in which the data available to more systematically study media effects are becoming more available. Okay? So scholars, they don't want to just take this hypodermic needle as gospel and not question it. They start to study media effects in a more systematic manner. And eventually they find that when you look at survey data, there's not really that much of an indication that this model holds, which is encouraging. Right? It's encouraging that we can sort of reject this, right? That it's not a hypodermic needle. It's not as though whoever controls the media is going to be able to get the uncritical public to think whatever they want to think, whatever they want them to think. Okay, so this is something that goes by the wayside, and in fact, the scholarly mindset here sort of swings all the way to the other end of the pendulum. Right? In fact, what we end up with is known as the minimal effects model. And here again, just as a simplification, this is a model that becomes relevant throughout starting in the 50s and up until about the 80s. In the 80s, you'll note the time frame of our paper here, 1982. Around this time, this model becomes less in fashion. But during this era, this is the idea that the media's ability to influence people is not really that strong, and it's not really direct. Okay, so here the idea, especially in a country, getting away from the totalitarian context to one in which people have a choice, not only whether or not they want to be exposed to the media, but also which media they want to be exposed to. People can select into hearing the media, they can select into hearing certain messages. And so the minimal effects model is that the power of the media is not really to persuade people. Messages in the media can often reinforce people's opinions, but not really change them. And so here, again, we're swinging to the other side of the pendulum. The hypodermic needle model telling us that the media has more or less unfettered power to persuade the public. The minimal effects model saying, on the other hand, that the media really doesn't have this effect. Okay, and some of the ideas here back in the minimal effects model, we've talked about selective exposure, that people can select into things that into media messages that agree with them, out of media messages that disagree with them. Here I mentioned survey data is used to sort of critically and empirically study the effect of the media. And what you see is that you can ask someone in a survey, to what extent do you follow the news media? Or maybe sometimes you get even more specific and ask them, have they heard of a specific question? Ask them that on one hand, and then ask them some other question as your dependent variable. Do you support President X, Y, or Z? Or maybe in an election context, do you support candidate X or candidate Y? Point being that you can look at media exposure measures in a survey and compare those to various evaluative questions, and there's not a ton of correlation there, right? So you would expect here in a country like the United States, where some people are exposed to the media, some aren't, if the media is driving people in one direction or another, you would see a lot of difference in the way people think about politics, depending on whether or not they're exposed to the media or not exposed to the media. And in fact, in this era, when you look at survey data, that's not what you find, right? You see people who aren't exposed to the media fairly similar to those who are exposed to the media. This is where we're getting the minimal effects idea from, that you aren't seeing these major differences between exposed and unexposed people. Okay. So the minimal effects model, it's, I suppose, encouraging compared to the hypodermic needle, but it's something that empirically speaking, maybe theoretically speaking as well, people begin to question it, right? So on the theoretical side, it does seem just a little bit odd that the media would not have any effect on the public, or very minimal effect on the public. Just in terms of going back to Lippmann and his description of how the media is the primary means by which people get information about the world, it would be sort of odd for the media just to have really no major effect. So that's one thing, just from a theoretical perspective, that maybe it's not that satisfying of a model to think about. From an empirical perspective, it's also troubling just in terms of the survey methods that are used, right? So we've talked a little bit about why you would want to sometimes do an experiment as opposed to just a normal survey. And this is one of the classic examples, or media effects. So here we're in the realm of a survey. You can ask somebody, how often do you pay attention to the political media? Have you heard of this story, or whatever your exposure measure is? The problem is that self-reported media exposure tends to be very unreliable. Okay, so this is something that I've conducted some research on my own. And it's, you can ask somebody these questions, and there are a couple of different reasons why they might not answer accurately, right? So on one hand, you can ask somebody, how often do you follow the news media? And even if you're somebody who never follows the news media, maybe you want to, maybe just for desirability reasons, you want to depict yourself as somebody who's informed and up to date. And so you might lie or mislead, give a misleading answer to the question. On the other hand, some people just may not remember what they've seen in the news, or have a good sense of how often they're seeing the news relative to what the survey experimenter is talking about. So it may not be that somebody is intentionally misleading, but just that by the limitations and the way that we can self-assess, you may not have an accurate measure. In either case, it's presenting problems, right? So the fundamental, the research here in terms of minimal effects is fundamentally depending on these measures of exposure, right? Again, the key here is that we're looking at exposure measures and comparing those to outcomes such as evaluations or candidate preferences. If the exposure measures are unreliable, that's sort of throwing out the entire analysis and conclusions that we can come to. Okay, so this is just setting up the backdrop for this Iyengar, Peters, and Kinder question, right? So they're responding to these two different points that I made with respect to minimal effects. First of all, again, just to recap, that theoretically speaking, it maybe doesn't make that much sense that the media would have no effect. So we're going to explore some other avenues by which the media might affect public opinion beyond just persuasion. And Iyengar, Peter, and Kinder, they're also noting the fundamental weakness here in the methods used to study media effects. Okay, so this is why they're bringing into the fray experimental methods, right? And this is, I think, overall just a really good example of the usefulness of experimental methods in public opinion research, right? So just, we'll get into back to our notes in a second, but just to, I'd point out here, if you note the title of the paper, the quotation's not so minimal. This is just indicating what the environment was that they were responding to when they were writing this paper. In 1982, the predominant approach among scholars to the media would have been minimal effects, and so this is a paper that's bringing us to what's still a relatively modern perspective, that the media does have some effects, even though it's not necessarily through direct persuasion. Right? Another aspect of the title here, talking about experimental demonstrations here. So this is the movement from an observational approach to an experimental approach. Okay, so just to sum that up here, we're moving from minimal effects to a more nuanced approach here. Okay, so just to summarize what I just said, moving away from the minimal effects is happening in two different respects. The theoretical innovation here, in this paper and in other papers we'll talk about, or other research we'll talk about, it involves, first of all, theoretically expanding the scope of what we're talking about. Okay, so rather than just talking about persuasion in and of itself, which probably isn't happening, right? We're still not saying that the media has this great persuasive power that the hypodermic needle model would imply, but maybe there's some other ways in which the media can still significantly influence the population. This paper is going to be talking about things, two things in particular. First of all, agenda setting. Second of all, priming. Priming probably being a term you should recognize from other parts in the semester. So these are the two means by which the media are potentially influencing the public, according to Iyengar et al. Next week, we'll introduce one other type of media effect, which we'll set aside for now, but just to mention it briefly, framing. This will be the topic of our next paper, which is another means by which potentially the media can influence the way people think about politics. For now, we'll just leave it at agenda setting and priming. So that's one major way in which this paper is progressing from our minimal effects paradigm. And then finally, the empirical approach. Again, I mentioned this here a second ago. This is just to wrap up. We're having an experimental study of media effects rather than an observational study. So that problem I just mentioned, as far as the weakness of surveys in measuring exposure to the media, that's being solved through this experiment, right? We'll talk more about it, but the short of it is just that through the experiment, the experimenters are the ones providing the media coverage, and so they know who is exposed to a media message and who is not exposed. That's one of the primary reasons we're moving to an experiment. In general, we're getting better causal inference from an experiment than correlational observational research. So there are a couple of different reasons that the method employed by Iyengar et al. Is superior than those that were employed prior to this paper. Okay. Before getting into the experiment, I think, again, it's a useful illustration of the type of experiment you guys might be thinking about in your own project. But before we get into that, let's focus a little bit more on these terms, agenda setting and priming. Okay, so again, the perspective here of the authors is that, again, it's probably not the case that the media is able to just directly embed messages in people's mind that they're going to accept without question. But there are ways in which the media does influence the public's thinking on politics or other things. The first of which here, agenda setting. I think both of these are fairly intuitive ideas, agenda setting and priming. Agenda setting isn't something I don't think we've talked about yet in class in any context. In this case, it's the idea that media coverage will influence the issues that voters find important. Okay, so if you see the media covering a particular issue, the examples we'll use in the experiment, at least the first experiment, is defense. If you see the media covering defense-related issues really frequently, you're going to be more likely to judge defense as being important, an important issue in politics. Okay. Beyond defense, they get into other issues, but it's a general prediction that they make. The issues that the media chooses to cover are going to be judged as more important to the public than issues that the media doesn't cover. Right? They sort of, in their experiments, stick with issues, but they also extend this topic to candidates, right? So a couple of you mentioned in your QQCs that there's some correspondence here to what maybe we saw in the recent primary. Right? You have a slate of 20 candidates. The agenda setting hypothesis here probably says that a select few, or maybe a select number, maybe not just a few, but a select number is these candidates are going to receive attention in the media. Those are the candidates that the public is going to judge as being relevant. Okay? And that's probably what we saw. If you're a candidate that wasn't in this group that was receiving any attention in the media, you would have been very unlikely to receive any traction, and that's probably the pattern we observe. Generally speaking, though, we'll frame these as hypotheses here just for the sake of being clear going forward into our experiment what's actually being tested. The hypothesis in this case, to state it that way, is just that as media coverage increases, voters, we'll say voters, just since we're in the political context here, voters will judge that issue to be more important. Okay, so nothing probably that shocking here, in terms of the theoretical insight. It's something that, in the context of our minimal effects paradigm, it would have been somewhat of a departure from that, but to us, it's a fairly intuitive idea. So agenda setting, one of the media effects that Iyengar et al. Are going to be testing, priming being the other. This is a term that I think most of you will hopefully recall from our discussion of attitude formation back toward the beginning of the semester. So specifically, we had our memory-based model by which we illustrated these priming effects, right? So if you remember the example I gave you about either Medicare for all, I think we had a Trump-related example, something like that. I'm not going off the top of my head here, but if you recall, we had some information in memory where maybe on immigration, there was a negative consideration for you. The economy, maybe positive consideration. We had things like tweets or just general demeanor of Trump, maybe a negative for you. Maybe we have this, and we could say whether it's a positive or negative for you. You can make your own judgment. That's not the point. But let's say you're somebody who likes the COVID-19 response of Trump, just for the sake of the example. In the current context, you're probably thinking a lot about this, right? This is what's going into your memory, and so maybe you're giving a positive evaluation of Trump. If in some point in the future immigration becomes relatively salient, you maybe give a negative response. This is just a review of the example we went through with the memory-based model, where the insight is just based on what you're primed to think about, based on the considerations that are made salient to you. You can come to a negative response or a positive evaluation of Trump at different points in time. Okay, and fundamentally the same thing is being stated here in this paper, right? The memory-based models may be giving us more of a psychological background for exactly how that's operating, but the actual pattern here that Iyengar et al. Are describing is pretty much exactly the same. Right? So this should hopefully be familiar to most of you, this idea of priming. Here again, just as stated in terms of a hypothesis. As media coverage of an issue increases, voters are more likely to evaluate public officials based on that issue. Right, so if you're in a setting where, and this is something that a lot of you wrote about in your QQC, which I'll talk about, maybe toward the end as well. If there's a particular thing that's happening in the news environment that the news is focusing specifically on one particular story and neglecting pretty much every other story, then public officials, the president, a senator up for re-election, your representative, they're going to be evaluated based on that dimension primarily, rather than some other dimension. Again, here, this is something that we should, I don't know that I need to belabor it that much just because we've talked about it. And it's something that, again, has some degree of intuitive resonance. But these are the two expectations that Iyengar et al. Are putting forward, right? That it's not that the media is persuading the public directly, and that's not really necessarily what we should be focusing on as scholars. There are other means by which the media and its coverage, what it elects to cover and what it elects not to cover, can influence the way that the public thinks about politics. And so these are the two primary ways, the two primary avenues, I should say, that Iyengar et al. Are theorizing that the media will affect public opinion. And so that is the theoretical setup for the paper. Okay, they're putting forward these two phenomena that they're going to test. And so here, what I'd like to transition to now is just a discussion of how these expectations are being tested. Okay, and so this is something that's done through a lab experiment. And I would say at the outset, I mentioned this before, but this is just a good example if you're somebody who's still not set on a specific experimental design or having trouble thinking through what your experiment might look like. This is a good example for the type of experiment you might be thinking about running. In this case, Iyengar et al. They're running a lab experiment. But this was 1982, right? In 1982, we didn't have the internet to run our surveys through. This sort of thing that they're doing could very easily be done today in the context of a survey experiment, to where you're putting together news stories or some other video, showing them to people, dividing people into control and treatment based on which video they're getting, and then judging how that video influences it. This is a type of experiment that I've done myself, numerous different times, and it's something that's very feasible to run in a survey context, right? So if you're somebody who's interested in this sort of thing, it would be a good potential route to take with your own experiment for our semester project. In this case, just to give you the general outline of their experiments, they have two. Okay, they have a study one, and then they have later on a study two they talk about, which both follow the same basic approach. And these are both following also the same basic approach that characterizes experiments in general, which we've talked about in class. So study one, we have some pre-treatment questions. And in this case, the questions in the pre-treatment and the post-treatment, they take the approach of asking them at time one and then asking them again at time two to get a sense of how they change. The questions in this case are things like what political issue, I think they give a list of 8, what political issue is most important to you, and you rank the issues, and then you also just judge them each individually, I think on a 1 to 5 scale, if I recall correctly. Rate the importance of this issue, and there are a few other importance measures. So importance is one thing that they're asking about. Another thing they're asking about pertains to President Carter, if I recall correctly. So this is a 1982 piece. The studies were run, if I recall, in 1981, early 1981. And so asking about Carter's response or treatment of various issues is how they're evaluating this priming hypothesis, right? They're saying, what do you think about Carter's performance on this issue or that issue? And then giving, the subjects are also going to give their evaluation of Carter, so you can see how these two things sort of correspond to one another, right? You can, in other words, see, are people, is there a strong degree of correspondence between people's evaluation of Carter to issue X or issue Y or issue Z or whatever, right? So that's the basic backdrop. That's what's being asked about in the questions. the post-treatment question. I guess I'm going to put this up here as well. Okay, this would be time 1, time 2 down here. And then in between, you've got, from what I recall, 4 different nights in which subjects are being brought into an experimental lab and shown these videos of network nightly news coverage here. So in the control condition, you're seeing just the pre-taped the coverage. I believe they're taping the coverage from the night before and then showing people the unedited program in the control condition. So whatever is being covered, whatever the issues are, that's what the subjects are seeing. In the treatment condition, let's maybe specify it this way. The treatment condition, or in other words, the defense condition, the experimenters are taking the footage from the nightly news and cutting into it. In other words, they're editing the footage and putting new footage in about defense-related issues. Okay. So in both of these cases, you're seeing nightly news coverage. It's just that in the treatment condition, the experimenters are taking the footage and putting in an issue of their own choosing so that they can then go and see, does this change people's ratings of importance of this issue? So that it's a fairly simple paradigm, at least in my view, right? The only difference here between control and treatment is they're inserting some additional footage of defense-related coverage. Study 2 is pretty similar to study 1. The only difference here being that they're using 3 separate issues rather than just one. So then we have pre-treatment questions, followed eventually by post-treatment questions. And in between, you're getting a nightly news broadcast, which in this case is going to involve either defense footage interspersed in addition to whatever else was being discussed, pollution, or inflation. Right. So at the end, everyone's answering the same questions. It's just which of these 3 issues is being emphasized in the coverage. Okay, so again, again, just to reiterate a previous point, the advantage here of an experiment beyond just the normal enhanced causal validity we have is that we know who is seeing these defense-related stories. We know these, the subjects in the treatment group are seeing them. Those in the control group are not seeing them. We know in study 2, those in this group are seeing defense-related stories. Those in the pollution condition are seeing pollution stories. Those in the inflation condition are seeing inflation stories. We don't have to ask the subjects, what did you see, right? We know exactly what they're being exposed to in each of these conditions because it's being controlled by the experimenter. This is the primary advantage here of this type of study relative to a strictly observational study. Okay. In terms of findings, I'll go to the paper here just to illustrate what they find. So here, scrolling down a little bit down to page 852 if you want to follow along. So this, beginning with just the agenda setting hypothesis here, again, the idea that seeing coverage of an issue in the news is going to lead to increased importance judgments of that issue. That's what's being illustrated in Table 1 for Study 1. Okay, so again, Study 1 involving just the defense treatment. So we're looking at this item up here. In this case, I'm not going to get into exactly what these numbers are indicating. If that's something that you're interested in, it's discussed in the paper. Basically, what these numbers are showing is that if it's a positive number, the importance rating is increasing in time 2 compared to time 1. If it's a negative number, the importance ratings are decreasing compared to time 1. So in this case, we see defense with a 0.9. That's indicating that in time 2, those who are seeing defense, they are rating this issue as more important than those than in time 1. Okay, if you're in the control, okay, these would be the subjects who did not see the defense problems. There's no significant effect. In fact, it's a little bit negative, but this is not a significant change. This is something again that they state in the
the body of the text here, that this is not a significant change. None of these are statistically significant. The only statistically significant change in the defense condition would be this 0.9. Okay, so this is the only significant change in time 1 to time 2. It's among those in the defense condition who are seeing these defense-related issue coverage. They are rating defense as more important than they did in time 1. And that's the only statistically significant effect here that they see. Okay, so that's just study 1 where they're looking at one particular issue, the defense issue. We can scroll down a little bit further here to table 2 showing the results from experiment 2 to where you have defense, pollution, and inflation in your treatment categories. So in this case, what we'd be interested in is what's going on in the diagonal entries here. Okay, so when you're giving these pollution stories, what's changing about your ratings of the importance of pollution, what's happening when you're giving the inflation coverage, what's happening when you're giving the defense coverage, okay? And in this case, in terms of inflation, this is not a significant effect, this 0.11, they talk about that. This is not a significant change. So it's, in other words, we can't be confident that this is actually something that's genuinely occurring in the data. It's something that could be due to just chance circumstances. This 1.53 for pollution, and then this 0.76 for defense, again, both positive, indicating that people are judging these issues to be more important in time 2 after seeing the coverage relating to the issues. These are both significant coefficients here. So in 2 out of these 3, cells here, which we're concentrating on, you see significant change in the direction we're expecting, right? That people are seeing coverage about a particular issue, and when you compare their time 2 response regarding the importance of that issue to their time 1 response regarding importance of that issue, they're judging the issue to be more important at time 2. So overall, this is pretty strong support for the agenda setting hypothesis. In study 1, this defense coefficient up here, this is showing the agenda setting effect. 2 out of the 3 tests here. In study 2, they're showing the same thing. So fairly strong results here as it pertains to agenda setting. In terms of priming, we go down to the next page, and again, the expectation here is that when the media is covering a particular story, people are going to be more likely to evaluate political candidates based on that issue. Okay, so here again, we're looking at Jimmy Carter, and the survey, the questionnaire, I should say, in the experiment, it's asking subjects to rate Jimmy Carter's performance on various issues that are being covered. In this case, we're going to ask how he's doing on pollution, inflation, and defense. And then we have various measures that by which subjects are evaluating Carter's performance in office. So we have an overall performance measure, which is what I'm going to focus on this here. The authors have some expectations as far as competency and integrity go, but I don't think they're the most important area to focus on. I'm just going to focus on the overall evaluation of Carter's performance. And so here, these are correlations, right? So when we look at the 0.59 and 0.38, I'm not going to get into, if you're somebody who knows what a correlation is and how to interpret correlation coefficients, then this would make more sense to you. The higher number, just to simplify, the higher number, the 0.59 compared to a 0.38, the higher number in this case just means that you can more easily predict people's evaluations of Carter based on how they're judging his performance on defense. Okay, so again, study 1 in this case, you're either seeing these defense items, these defense coverage items in the news, or you're not. Those who are seeing the defense coverage in the news that they're seeing, they are relying more on their defense evaluations of Carter to inform their overall evaluation. Okay, so this is basically what the priming hypothesis is saying. Going down to our next table here, table 4, this is making the same sort of analysis here, just based on these 3 issue items instead of 2 in study 1. So again, I'm not going to focus on these, the competence or the integrity, but just Carter's overall job performance. And here again, pretty strong results in all 3 of these cases. Whether you're in the condition that's emphasizing defense, pollution, or inflation, in all 3 of these cases, what's happening in this column, these 3 cells that I'm putting in boxes, in other words, they're greater than these three in which this sort of issue is not covered in the media. Okay, so just to simplify this again, if you're somebody who isn't familiar with how to interpret these correlation coefficients, these are showing that you assign somebody to issue X, Y, or Z, in this case, defense, pollution, or inflation. When the media covers that issue, people are more likely to judge Carter based on that issue. So if you're somebody who really thinks Carter is doing a great job on defense and you see his defense, you see defense being covered, you're going to be more likely to think he's doing a good job. If you're somebody who thinks he's doing a poor job on defense and you see defense being covered, you'll probably downgrade your evaluation a little bit. And the same thing for either pollution or inflation. Whatever issue is being covered in the media, people are more likely to base their judgments on the president or other elected officials based on that issue. This is priming. You can refer back to our member-based model for the mechanism by which this is happening. People are just viewing these issues as more salient, and so they're recalling from their mind more considerations regarding whatever the issue is that's being covered. So we can come at this from an issue of knowledge, a perspective of knowledge based on these other readings we've done. Okay, so this all in all, these results here from the experiments are landing pretty strong support for their predictions with respect to agenda setting and priming. One other thing I think I wanted to mention here, just again in relating what we're talking about here to prior readings in our course, if we scroll down to page 854, sort of to the text here, a lot of this, the word counter-arguing or counter-arguers, this comes up a lot. And so maybe when you're reading through this and you're reading all about counter-arguments and how they relate to this agenda-setting effect, maybe this rung a bell in your mind about prior readings that we've done in this class or prior theories that we discussed in this class. To me, this whole discussion here, right where I have room, this all reminded me a lot about disconfirmation bias. As you recall back to our Tabor and Lodge paper about motivated reasoning, one way that motivated reasoning works, one type of motivated reasoning that they discuss is disconfirmation bias, where people hear information, and if it goes against what their predispositions are, they'll spend time counter-arguing against that information. They'll, in other words, go through mental gymnastics in their mind to discount the effect of that information. And basically what's being illustrated in these data, in this experiment, is just that to the extent that people are able to counter-argue, to the extent that they do engage, I should say, in counter-arguing, the effect of agenda setting basically goes away, right? So if you hear, if you're somebody who's really politically sophisticated, you know a lot about politics, and you have the capacity to engage in this counter-argumentation, you could hear a story about national defense, and maybe you just have it in your mind already, based on your predispositions, that national defense isn't that important. You can do away with the effect of the agenda setting just by counter-arguing against the story, right? You hear it in the media, and maybe it's simultaneous to the story. You're thinking to yourself, well, I don't really buy what Tom Brokaw or whoever we're talking about is saying. I don't think this is that important, and you're drawing to mind various arguments against the importance of defense. Okay. On the other hand, if you're somebody who is not very politically sophisticated, they get into this discussion, you're not very knowledgeable or sophisticated, you don't have the capacity to counter-argue anything that's going on in the story, you're the type of person that's going to be most susceptible to this agenda-setting effect. Okay, so again, here, I think this is a pretty strong correspondence to what we've said prior to this class in terms of disconfirmation bias. And I think that's just something I wanted to highlight in terms of making these connections to what we've talked about earlier in the class. All right, so just to wrap up this discussion here, getting to some of your QQCs, all of you submitted one, and they're good. They were good as usual, so I appreciate that. I appreciate you keeping up with the assignments as we transition into online instruction. So a few of you mentioned this question here, either network TV versus internet or social media. Or maybe you made a slightly different argument about the time dynamic. It's 1982. Is that as relevant for today? And these are good questions. This is something that I think is something you've got to ask for any paper that you read and you see it's 1982. In this case, I think my response would be that the findings and the theories and hypotheses described in this paper are still pretty relevant for today. A few reasons I would say that's the case here. So first of all, in terms of this dynamic, network TV versus internet and social media, this is something that maybe the case that TV is becoming less relevant has been a little bit overstated, at least in my opinion. And so this is something that, as I'm thinking through this discussion, I went and brought down some survey data just to get a sense of what sort of media do people actually follow these days. So here, I'll preface all this by saying, or maybe reminding you about just the overall, sometimes questionable reliability of survey responses relative to the types of media or media exposure in general, the types of media that people follow. So keep that in mind, keep that caveat in mind, just the asterisk here, that we're relying on survey reports here rather than actual observation. But here, this is a survey from Pew, a credible, reliable, to the extent that survey data are reliable, outlet here for our question. So in this case, they're asking in 2019, what is the most common way you get political and election news? And so here, radio, not that common anymore. Print, not that common anymore. We look here though, so those who either get the most of their news from local television, national television, or cable television, this is accounting for about 45%, so still a pretty substantial share. Those who are getting most of their news through social media or news on the internet or an app, looks like about 43. So there's a rough parity here between those who are getting their news primarily from television and those who are getting the news primarily from the internet, at least according to these data. And so the first response, I guess, to the current relevance of this paper would just be that, well, TV is still, to many Americans, a pretty relevant, not necessarily network TV at this point, but whatever TV source you're using, it's still, a fairly ubiquitous source of information. That being said, it's a good question here when we're focusing on this sort of equally substantial type of news media, the social media or media through a website or an app. It's a very good question here. Do these effects we're talking about actually apply in these settings as well? In general, this is something that it's still what I would characterize as an ongoing and emerging, maybe is a better way to put it, area of research, just relating what we know about media effects in a television context to the internet. In the studies I've seen, there do seem to be agenda setting effects on the internet. The main question here is just who is the person, or I guess maybe a better way to say it, who is the entity, or what is the entity that's actually setting the agenda in these cases? It's, is it what we consider the traditional or mainstream media outlets? Do they still have the major agenda setting power that maybe they did in the past when so many people relied on network television as opposed to the internet? Or are there maybe alternative outlets? Are there different types of entities that are doing the agenda setting, right? Or maybe in terms of social media, maybe it's those who are actually engaging in social media, which by and large would be the general public, right? So there's these questions, right? The agenda setting hypothesis, the priming hypothesis, I think they're both still relevant to these different types of news media. It's just that, who is actually doing the priming, who's actually doing the agenda setting. That's possibly a lot different than who was doing these things in 1982. So good questions there. Another QQC response that a few of you brought up, which I think is a good one here. So there's a quote, this would have been a quote on page 849, which I think is pretty applicable to today's environment. So here we're just describing this general priming, or the authors, I should say, are describing this general priming hypothesis. So by attending to some problems and ignoring others, media may also alter the standards by which people evaluate government. I call this priming. Consider, for example, that early in a presidential primary season, the national press becomes fascinated by a dramatic international crisis at the expense of covering worsening economic problems at home. one consequence may be that the public will worry less, more about the foreign crisis and less about economic woes. Classic agenda setting. But in addition, the public's evaluation of the president may now be dominated by his apparent success in handling of the crisis. His management or mismanagement of the economy may now count for rather little. So here we're in the, I'm talking to you over a microphone through a pre-recorded lecture, and so obviously we've had our crisis of our own that we're dealing with. It's a crisis to you and I as teacher and student. It's a crisis to the world and the international community as a whole, and it's certainly something that's transfixing the media, justifiably so, over the last month plus. And so we would expect here, this is the point a lot of you made in your QQC, that potentially this sort of effect, the agenda setting effect and the priming effect, are going to be on display in the current election, right? That this, assuming that we're still, hopefully we're not in this precise situation as far as COVID-19 goes, but assuming it's still a relevant thing going into November, which just given the timeline of the vaccine we're expecting, that might well be the case. It could be that the media's coverage here is going to cause this to be the most important issue to people. And it could be the case that this election hinges largely on Donald Trump's response to COVID-19 as opposed to some other issues, the economy, for instance. Right? So perhaps whether or not the public views him as managing the situation well or mismanaging the situation will be very salient based on this priming. And so I just thought, and those of you who posted this in your QQC agreed, this is a very relevant quotation relating this research to what's happening in the actual political world right now. Okay, that is actually the end of this this discussion I wanted to have on the Iyengar et al. Paper. I'll leave you with a few different notes, the first of which here, this paper is going to be the one that we read next, Chong and Drukman. I mentioned this idea of framing here earlier in our discussion. This would be an additional way in which the media potentially influences the public, and this will be a more recent but not necessarily contemporary paper, 2007. 2007 is pretty recent to me, but for many of you, probably not. So we'll talk about this next time. You will have a QQC for this due on Friday, Friday by midnight, before midnight, I should say. Otherwise, please, again, I'll remind you of the discussion at the beginning of this video. Please, if you're somebody who has any reservations or uncertainty about the paper, the project, I should say, specifically whether or not you have an experiment or what your experiment will look like, stop by the Zoom office hours on Wednesday or otherwise get in touch with me, and I would be happy to talk with you about it. All right, so that's it. Thanks everyone for watching this. Again, I hope everyone's doing well. I hope you can continue to do well. And I will see you guys, or talk to you guys in the next video.